Imagine this. You're a Neanderthal man living roughly 45,000 years ago in what is now northern Iraq. You've lost your lower right arm, your left eye is damaged, maybe blind. You can barely hear, you walk with a painful limp. By every measure of raw survival, you should be dead. But you're not. You're alive, middle-aged, fed, sheltered, and when you finally die, your people bury you deliberately, carefully, in a cave called Shanidar. His name, assigned by archaeologists, is Shanidar Vafers. And his skeleton is one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for understanding what happened to ancient humans when they got old or injured. Because here's the thing, this man could not have survived alone. Not with one arm, not partially blind, not limping through a landscape full of predators and rough terrain. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. Someone chose, day after day, to keep him alive when abandoning him would have been easier. And he's not the only one. At La Ferracie, a rock shelter in southwestern France, archaeologists found another Neanderthal, labeled La Ferracie 1. He died somewhere between the ages of 40 and 55, which for a Neanderthal was genuinely old. His skeleton tells a brutal story. Osteoarthritis, a healed clavicle fracture, a healed femur fracture. This man had been seriously injured, possibly more than once, and he recovered. Bones don't heal overnight. A broken femur takes weeks to mend, during which you can't walk, can't hunt, can't do much of anything. Someone cared for him through that. Someone brought him food and water while he lay still and waited to heal. And then he kept living. For years, maybe decades, with joints that ached every morning. These aren't isolated stories. Bioarchaeologists, the scientists who study ancient human remains specifically to understand how people lived, now argue that caring for the vulnerable is not a modern invention. It's not something we figured out when we built hospitals or wrote laws about elder care. It's a behavior traceable as far back as Neanderthals, deeply embedded in the social fabric of human evolution. The evidence is right there in the bones. People who should have died didn't, because other people wouldn't let them. Now fast forward about 15,000 years to a site called Sunghir, near the city of Vladimir in Russia. Around 30,000 to 32,000 years ago, a community of early modern humans buried an adult male in a way that makes archaeologists stop and pay attention. His grave was elaborate. Thousands of ivory beads, carefully carved and sewn into what was likely clothing or a burial garment. Polished mammoth ivory spears laid beside him. His body covered in red ochre, a mineral pigment that required deliberate effort to collect and prepare. This wasn't a quick burial. This was a ceremony. Someone, probably many people, spent enormous amounts of time preparing this man's final resting place. The sheer labor involved in crafting thousands of tiny beads suggests this individual held significant status within his community. And while we can't say with certainty that his status came specifically from his age, the pattern is suggestive. This was someone the group valued enough to honor with extraordinary effort. Now here's where honesty matters. The skeletal record is sparse. We're talking about scattered remains across tens of thousands of years and millions of square miles. The people we find are, by definition, the ones who survived long enough to be buried in ways that preserved their bones. That's a biased sample. And elaborate grave goods like the ones at Sunghir might reflect clan membership, hunting prowess, or social connections rather than age-based reverence specifically. We have to be careful about reading too much into individual burials, but here's what we can say with confidence. The pattern is consistent. Across different species, different continents, different time periods, we find the same thing. Individuals with severe disabilities and age-related conditions who survived far longer than they could have alone. People who were cared for, not discarded. Communities that invested resources in members who couldn't fully reciprocate. And by the time humans started building permanent settlements, writing things down, and organizing into what we'd recognize as civilizations, this wasn't a new idea. It was already ancient. Caring for elders wasn't invented by any government or religion. It was inherited from a tradition so old that even our evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals, practiced it. So when the first civilizations appeared and began formalizing how societies should treat their oldest members, they weren't starting from scratch. They were building on something that had been there all along. And build on it they did. When ancient Egypt emerged as one of the world's first great civilizations, respect for the elderly wasn't treated as optional or aspirational. It was woven into the fabric of everything: their laws, their literature, their family structures, even their economy. Start with what they believed. Egyptian texts idealized a human lifespan of 100 years, not as fantasy, but as a genuine aspiration. The instruction of Ani, one of the most widely copied wisdom texts in ancient Egypt, explicitly praised elders for their accumulated knowledge and urged younger generations to seek their counsel. Listen to your elders. Learn from those who came before you. This wasn't just polite advice. It was moral instruction, repeated and reinforced across centuries of Egyptian literary tradition. Now, it's worth pausing here. These are idealized texts. They describe what society said should happen, not necessarily what happened in every household for every family. The gap between official wisdom literature and the daily reality of a poor farming family along the Nile was probably significant. But the fact that this ideal existed, was written down, copied, taught, and preserved tells us something real about the cultural weight placed on age and experience. And here's what's remarkable. In Egypt, getting old didn't push you out of power, it pulled you deeper in. Pharaoh Pepi II reportedly lived into his 90s, ruling for what ancient sources describe as one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. Older men served as viziers, the highest administrative office beneath the pharaoh. They commanded armies. They oversaw temple construction and managed the state's resources. Age wasn't a disqualification for authority. It was practically a prerequisite. The assumption was simple. You'd seen more, you knew more. You were more valuable precisely because you'd survived long enough to accumulate wisdom that younger people hadn't. But reverence only matters if it translates into daily life. And in Egypt it did. Household records from the workmen's town of Kahun, a planned settlement built to house laborers working on royal pyramid projects, reveal something that looks surprisingly familiar. Multi-generational families living together under one roof. Aging mothers and grandparents listed as household members alongside their adult children and grandchildren. This wasn't accidental. This was the default. When you got old in Egypt, your family took care of you. You stayed in the home, you were fed, housed, and included. And if family wasn't enough motivation on its own, the law stepped in. Egyptian legal documents, particularly wills and inheritance records, show a deliberate system designed to enforce filial duty. Parents could structure their estates to reward children who cared for them in old age and penalize those who neglected them. If you looked after your aging mother, you inherited more. If you abandoned her, you got less or nothing. This wasn't informal social pressure. This was elder care formalized into law, written on papyrus, witnessed, and enforced. The transition from the kind of instinctive, relationship-based care we see in prehistoric communities to a codified legal obligation happened right here. But Egypt went even further than family obligations and inheritance law. The state itself got involved. During the New Kingdom period, government records show that men classified as old received monthly grain rations from state institutions. Veteran soldiers who had served their time were granted honorary temple posts, positions that came with food, shelter, and social standing. These weren't charity. These were earned entitlements, institutional support systems for people who had contributed to society and could no longer fully support themselves. If that sounds familiar, it should. These are functionally pensions, not modern pensions with investment portfolios and retirement accounts, but the same basic idea. You served the state takes care of you when you're old. Egypt figured this out over 3,000 years ago, and the tradition didn't stop there. Fast forward roughly 2,000 years from New Kingdom Egypt to a site called Hippos Susita, an ancient city perched on a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. In the 5th century, someone built a structure there and laid a mosaic floor with an inscription that reads, "Peace be with the elders." Archaeologists believe this represents the earliest physical evidence of a dedicated elder care facility. Not a family home where grandparents happen to live. A purpose-built institution designed specifically to care for aging members of the community. From Neanderthals carrying food to a one-armed man in a cave, to Egyptian viziers ruling into their 90s, to Byzantine mosaic floors blessing the elderly by name, the through line is unbroken. Caring for old people isn't a burden that modern society invented. It isn't a policy debate we stumbled into because medicine got too good at keeping people alive. It's one of the oldest commitments humans have ever made to each other. We've been doing it for at least 45,000 years, probably longer. If this changed how you think about aging, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more where this came from.